Welcome to this week's episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. On this week's episode, somebody learns a very dangerous lesson. Let's get started. A Jew, a Lebanese Druze, and a Persian walk into a room and sit down for a lovely dinner. This actually isn't a joke. This is what actually happened. I apologize that this is somewhat unrelated to today's topic, but I felt I really had to share. Some of my regular listeners might have remembered an episode I did a while ago about the allies that we have. And I talked about our neighbor. My wife and I live next door to an amazing Lebanese Druze couple. They were undergoing a bunch of renovations, and so unfortunately we didn't have a chance to be invited over to their home for dinner. But finally, after a long wait, they invited us over, and we had an amazing and beautiful meal together. It was myself and my wife, obviously we're Jewish, and we had the Lebanese Druze and their family, and then we had a friend of theirs who's Persian. To tell you how amazing this evening was, just the symbolism of the fact that these three groups sitting down and having a lovely meal together, the Lebanese, the Israelis, and the people from Iran, I was so touched to be able to eat some of their amazing Lebanese food. And of course, my wife and I made sure to bring over some Israeli wine from the north and a lot of Israeli treats and snacks for dessert. And we sat around and literally just lived the amazing North American life away from the hate, hoping for a day that we can visit their family in Lebanon and they can visit our family in Israel, something they repeatedly said they wish they could do. Technically, as Canadians, they are allowed to go to Israel on a Canadian passport, but the fear of being found out by the Lebanese government or Hezbollah that they were in Israel and the risk that that poses to the family they still have living in Lebanon is too scary for them, which I understand. But I had to share that this was such a beautiful, symbolic, amazing night. And hopefully, God willing, one day, this will just be the normal course of events of the Middle East. Groups getting together, visiting other people's homes in different countries, and sharing the similarities, and I'll be honest, the mutual hatred of the Iranian government. But now on to the topic at hand. Most of you who follow the news have probably heard the recent incident that happened in the West Bank, or Judea and Samaria. It was all over the news. Everybody heard about this American activist who got killed by the IDF while, they say, doing nothing. When I saw this, along with other current events going on, and even some past events that have happened, I knew right away that this is sort of a repeat of history. And the story isn't exactly what it seems. This past week, the American-Turkish activist Aysenur Eg was apparently killed by IDF forces doing something in the West Bank. As you know, if you've listened to this podcast before, of course, the media is on it immediately. The PR teams are going crazy. They talk about how the IDF murdered her. They murdered her purposely. She was doing nothing wrong. And of course, Israel, as any democratic and normal nation would do, says they'll investigate because that's how you find out what happens. You can't just make it up. We saw nearly immediately all of her friends, American and West Bank friends, were suggesting that she was targeted and she was murdered in cold blood by Israelis. They leave out the fact that clearly, according to other people at the scene, including the Israelis, there was apparently a protest happening in the West Bank, as there typically is, and there was rock throwing. For the record, rock throwing usually means cinder blocks. They call them rocks to make it seem like it's no big deal, but it's cinder blocks and it's Molotov cocktails and things like that. And unfortunately, in the West Bank, the Israeli army doesn't take kindly to violence and threats against themselves or Israeli people who live in the area. The irony is that we spoke about this not that long ago on the podcast, the fact that the people in the West Bank or Judea and Samaria complain all the time about how Israeli quote-unquote settlers, they're not settlers, are attacking, and where's the Israeli government to stop this? Okay, so you ask for the Israeli government to ensure violence doesn't happen. So that goes both ways, right? So when you commit violence, you want it to be stopped. Or maybe you're just one-sided on this issue and think that certain people are allowed to cause problems and others are not. One thing I will point out, which is sometimes unfortunate but kind of laughable, is the fact that they talk about all of the footage from Gaza and the West Bank. We see endless photos and videos of all these terrible things that the IDF does. Every time you see like a young person going up to a Israeli soldier, there are 10 cameras rolling, causing riots. They have their cameras rolling. But amazingly, when these violent acts of literal murder that they claim happen, apparently nobody has a cell phone, nobody has a camera. I find it really hard to believe that during this riot, they apparently film all the time when it's in Gaza or anywhere else in the West Bank. They didn't have a phone the time that someone's killed on purpose, apparently. No one has any footage to show. It only leads me to believe that maybe they're not telling you the truth. And maybe there's actual footage that shows contrary to what they claim. So therefore, they don't show it to anybody. They don't release it because it would validate the IDF's claims that she, an American-Turkish activist, was a part of the protests, the violence and throwing things and attacking people. And they don't want to show that. So maybe that's why a piece of video doesn't exist. And honestly, I really want to point out a very interesting thing here. And this is going to be a theme for the next few minutes because there are a few incidents we've seen this before. But here is a perfect example of what I'm calling learning a very dangerous lesson. This woman chose to go to Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, which obviously right now is a little bit on edge considering the current attempts to get rid of Hamas from the West Bank. There are missions almost every day into the West Bank to root out the terrorists that are attempting suicide bombings and things like that. But this young woman decided now's a perfect time to visit a war zone. And that's on her. She could choose to do that. That's totally up to her. But that doesn't save you from consequences, unfortunately. When I was in Israel this summer, I accepted the fact that I might have to flee from rockets, which I did at one point. The problem here, I think, is that this American-Turkish young lady probably spent a little too much time in America and a little bit too much time in liberal colleges because she got this spoiled nature to her protesting. In the United States currently, there are very few consequences to what's been going on in the streets of Europe and America and pretty much on every college campus. These spoiled young people have decided to take over places they shouldn't be. They've decided to threaten and attack Jewish people. They decide to spit on and beat up and hit police officers. And I hate to say, there's very little consequences, either because the police are outnumbered or because it's too difficult to try and arrest someone in a huge populated area of rabid anti-police kind of people, that if you grab one, you might be attacked. It's very difficult for them to actually face consequences, and they haven't been. Even the schools themselves, who said they're going to uphold the safety on their campuses, secretly didn't expel the students who got caught doing all of these bad things. There has been zero consequences. So does it surprise me when an American goes to a war zone they know nothing about, that they've only seen on TikTok, and then ends up doing the same thing they do in America, throwing rocks at people, throwing Molotov cocktails, yelling, spitting, whatever, all the things they do in America and get away with. And she thinks that it's going to be the same in the West Bank. And it's not. It is a war zone. That is a real conflict. And the Israeli army doesn't mess around. This isn't the American police who give you a slap on the wrist or just let you go and say, don't do it again. So my understanding of what happened here, according to some of the reports, is that she took part in a very hostile protest, they call it. It had been started to be broken up by the IDF, and apparently her and a few others didn't stop and were still doing all of the things that they shouldn't have been doing. And unfortunately, not that I want this person to be shot, there was consequences to her actions. This might be a very bad comparison, but if I was to walk up to a police officer in North America and slap him across the face, I'm going to assume I might get shot, I might get beaten up, I might get tasered. That's a reality. I accept that. I wouldn't do it, and that's probably why I wouldn't do it. But when you're spoiled and you've gotten away with your quote-unquote activism with no consequences, maybe you didn't realize, you weren't smart enough to realize, going to a war zone and thinking it's the same as the streets of New York City is a very different thing. And not to suggest I'm just making this theory up out of whole cloth, but it's really funny that I've been validated in my theory, considering this past week we had the most unbelievable proof come out on TikTok. On TikTok this past week, many of you might have seen it, there's a young lady named Maya, and she's on TikTok saying, and I quote, "You can't even throw a rock at an IDF soldier anymore without going to jail." And that was her suggestion of like how terrible times have been. We used to be able to just throw rocks at IDF soldiers and they would just take it. First of all, you shouldn't be throwing rocks at anybody, but they justify it because of the quote unquote occupation, which is complete BS. But just the entitlement to a young woman claiming that she should have the right to assault other people because she feels like it. Pretty much it. I feel justified. Now, ironically, in theory, could the IDF soldier not then be justified for beating the crap out of you or taking you to jail or whatever he does after you tried to assault him? Is that not also his right? Just consider the entitlement that you have to go online and openly say that you should have the right to assault other people as long as you feel you're justified to do it. This is probably the same kind of stuff on TikTok that this Turkish American activist was watching and probably felt the same way. When she was quote unquote protesting for the Palestinian Arab people, she probably felt, I should be able to throw rocks and Molotov cocktails and tell the IDF I'm not listening and I'm going to continue to riot no matter what you say. You can definitely see, I hate to call it, the American entitlement rubbing off on these people, believing that they have a right to do essentially whatever they want without consequences. And this goes to yet another proof of this situation. It's a little older. You probably remember it. It was from the Columbia University quote-unquote encampment when they took over a building illegally and had the nerve to come out onto national television and say, quote, "We deserve humanitarian aid. The school should be bringing us water and food every day until we decide we want to leave this building that we're holding illegally, because we are entitled to have humanitarian aid while we're doing something illegal." This is proof of the American mindset that they can essentially do whatever they want with zero consequences, and not only no consequences, but you should be thanking us and giving us food and allowing us to do these things because we are just literally entitled American people. So does it surprise me when an American with that sense of entitlement goes to the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, and causes trouble thinking they're going to get away with it? And does it surprise me then that they don't get away with it? It's a war zone after all. It doesn't surprise me at all. Like I said, it's unfortunate and it'd be nice if someone wasn't killed in this situation, but it's really sad to think that this is somehow the Israelis' fault that an entitled person came from America thinking that there were no consequences for her actions. And this isn't like we haven't seen this before. We have seen something very similar before, and that is the 2010 Turkish flotilla that happened. Many of you may not have remembered this or heard of this, especially if you were not involved in the Israel-Palestine issue way back. In 2010, a number of Turkish quote-unquote activists, peace activists, political activists, all decided to get on a boat in Turkey, it was actually 2 boats, and try to see what happens if they crossed an internationally recognized blockade held by Israel and Egypt. And these activists attempted to fully knowingly break this international blockade and, according to them, bring humanitarian aid and all kinds of stuff that they claimed the people of Gaza needed. Now, in reality, we know that the Israelis offered for these Turkish activists to take all of their aid, bring it to the port of Ashkelon, which is just next to Gaza. It will be checked for any kind of contraband, and it will be sent right into Gaza, no problem, just like every other shipment to Gaza. But they refused because they wanted to essentially create an international incident, create some sort of problem, so they purposefully wanted to break the law and test the IDF, really. As these 2 boats reached closer to Gazan waters, the Israeli Navy decided that they were going to essentially destroy these boats so they couldn't go any further. They gave them warnings to turn back. They didn't. So they damaged the boat's propellers so they couldn't go any further. So now these boats are kind of just hanging out and floating around. And then the IDF decided to go, because this is an illegal action, and get on the boat. And there are videos that you could still see today of these flotillas being raided by Israeli commandos from helicopters. And the minute that these quote unquote peace activists saw the Israelis coming down from the helicopter, you could see in the video, they have metal pipes, they have bars, they have all kinds of things that they've created in order to physically attack the Israeli soldiers. And you see them do it. They are swinging. They throw one IDF soldier off of the boat into the water. It is a S show, for lack of a better word. And again, these are peace activists, apparently. Needless to say, of course, when the news hit that this flotilla had been stopped, had been raided, everyone was saying Israel is terrible. They're just peace activists trying to bring Band-Aids and baby food into Gaza. All of that was a lie. The video eventually surfaced from the IDF, and we saw what they were really intending to do, the weapons they had smuggled on board. And they weren't about trying to bring anything to Gaza. They were about trying to test the IDF and to see what would happen. And they effed around, and they found out. Not that I'm proud that this young activist Turkish woman from this long line of quote-unquote Turkish peace activists was killed. But when you F around, you tend to find out, especially when you're in a war zone. In the end, it's just so easy for the misinformation to hit the news so quickly. We've seen it in Gaza. Now we see it in the West Bank. We saw it in 2010 with the flotilla. It is so easy for these lies to spread because the IDF takes some time to investigate, to find out what actually happened, to get the videos to prove what actually happened. But the quote-unquote peace activists can just essentially tell the biased anti-Israel media anything they want, and it's taken as gold. It must be true. 2 things that you can take from this podcast. Number 1, be aware whenever they claim that it's a quote-unquote activist doing these things, that doesn't necessarily make them rightful and justified and totally peaceful, as we saw with probably this lady, some of the other people that we talked about in this podcast, and the Turkish flotilla filled with people with metal pipes to beat up Israeli soldiers. Not exactly peaceful. And the other thing that we learned, unfortunately, is that actions have consequences. And maybe, unfortunately, people today, especially from America, don't really understand that actions have consequences because they've never had to learn that in America. But we can see this spoiled nature that's happening amongst young Americans who love to pretend and cosplay as quote-unquote activists, i.e. wannabe terrorists, and go to places like the West Bank and do things that they do in America and think they can get away with it. It is absolutely tragic that this young woman lost her life, but it is unfortunate that she learned a very difficult lesson. And hopefully many other spoiled American activists see what happened here and realize that this is no joke. This is a war zone, not the streets of New York. This has been another episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. Don't forget to check us out on social media at jdr.podcast and check out some of our other episodes on your favorite podcast source. We'll see you next time.